Hello and welcome. My name is Stephanie Brun de Pontet. I've asked my colleague Craig Aronoff to share some stories from clients he's worked with who've overcome tremendous adversity and challenges in the past as an example of family business resilience.
Good morning, Craig. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me a little bit about family businesses that have demonstrated resilience through adversity in the past. I think that's one of the many strengths of family businesses. Sometimes they have the long perspective of history that they turn to in their own narratives and help them navigate new challenges as they come up. And I know that you've worked with families that have had that experience, right? I know that you've worked in a lot of media companies that are undergoing tremendous disruption in their industry. And then as they kind of hit the storm of the Great Recession, would have had that additional challenge layered on top. So curious to have you share some of that experience of clients that navigated that successfully.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. It's great to be with you. Always great to be with you. My only regret is that we can't actually be together, but why should we be different than anybody else under the circumstances?
Right.
You're right. I've been doing this kind of work for a long time now, maybe 35 years or so. And I had an interest in journalism. I was a journalism undergraduate in college, and I sort of gravitated toward businesses that were in the media industry. And many of them, the vast majority of them, of course, were family owned, and many of them had very long histories. So going back a century or more. And owning newspapers in particular was a very lucrative business. As newspapers evolved, they typically became local monopolies, and they basically printed not only newspapers, but kind of printed money. And it didn't take being a very great manager to do it, because there was nobody else around that you could get by the eyes of everybody in the community in terms of advertising with. So things were smooth and easy, and the number of them made a point of expanding and buying additional properties. And this went on and on, well into the 70s and the 80s, and even the 90s. And then there began to be talk about this new technology. And it was not what they didn't think of it as direct competition. It wasn't printing. It wasn't going out and selling subscriptions for the most part. But as you know, people began to depend on the internet for information instead of these slow clumps of paper that were thrown on your driveway, which now seems antediluvian almost, although I picked up 3 this morning myself. But then I'm antediluvian too. So businesses began to think about, oh my goodness, how are we going to change? They were casual about it for the most part. They weren't rigorous in their strategic planning. They never had to do strategic planning before. And then almost all of a sudden it hit. And they began to lose classified ads, and they began to lose display ads, and they began to lose circulation. And they began to struggle and say, what do we do now?
Right.
There are kind of 2 examples from the industry I want to talk about today. And please interrupt if you have any questions.
Sure.
Both former clients, and both who worked out ways to not only survive, but ultimately thrive. And they worked out very different ways of doing it. One is a client that has been quite open about our work with them, Schurz Communications, and you and I have both done work with that client.
Wonderful.
And they paid a lot of attention to developing their governance structures, both family and in terms of their independent board of directors. And they got some excellent independent directors who again began to sound the alarm about the need for greater strategic planning, and sound the alarm that things in the future were not going to be as they were in the past. And the family was gathered together and built alignment and built commitment to one another, cohesiveness with one another, and had a great shared sense of identity with the company. the Great Recession is what really brought all this into great clarity. And all of a sudden,
to be clear, you had been able to help them with the governance structures in advance of that. Yes, was that
correct,
the timing?
right. So yeah, this goes back to the aught 4, 5, 6 period where we were putting their governance structures together, and the recession really hit in 8 and 9. And suddenly Schurz was not able to pay its dividend, which had been paying for many, many years. They had preached that those who were not employed by the business should not live on their dividends, but some of them had mortgages that were a lot larger than they would have been, and they were paying for private schools for their kids and things of that nature.
Right.
And then suddenly the business wasn't what it was anymore. And I remember the family meeting where we processed that. And we talked about, if and whether dividends would ever come back. And of course, it was the hope that it would, but there was no assurance that it was. And they worked very hard to make them understand that this wasn't just a glitch. This wasn't just a temporary downturn in their normal business, but their normal business wasn't functioning as it used to function. Now they were somewhat diversified. They had television and some cable, in addition to newspapers, because newspapers were in terrible shape.
Right.
But they also said, and we've got to be much more proactive. So they began to say, look, it's not happened to television yet, but it will. And we need to deal with this. So
did they take some of the lessons, I guess, from what they saw with the newspaper industry to evolve and evaluate their radio and television assets a little bit more critically than
absolutely
they have otherwise done? Okay.
Yeah,
so kind of, again, taking the knowledge and the wisdom, right? The school of hard knocks, learning and adapting.
Learning from their own experience,
right.
which is a wonder, everybody should learn from their own experience. But ultimately, Schurz decided they had to be a completely different kind of business.
Mm-hmm.
And now they have sold all of their newspapers late because they didn't get great value for them. They sold all their television stations. Some would argue early, but they wanted to make sure their value was still very substantial, and they made a good sale and they had good proceeds from it. And the family didn't say, "Oh, let's divide up the proceeds and go our separate ways." They said, and they understood this was the plan that was explained and adopted by the family governance structure, as well as the board. We're going to transform. It's still going to be Schurz Communication. We're going to transform this business, and we're going to get into the more future-looking and more lucrative businesses that relate to managing information infrastructure for companies.
Right.
And of course, most of the people in the family couldn't even imagine what that meant in terms of a business. In addition to not understanding necessarily what the revenue flows would be from it. But to make a long story short, not so short, they have now transformed the business, and they are in completely different businesses, with the exception of some small cable operations, than what they were in 10 years ago.
Right.
The family is still committed. The family is still cohesive. The family still strongly identifies with the business as a whole. They still have their family meetings every year, and they have a better understanding of things are not going to always be the way they were. Their dividend was restored, and interestingly, where the family used to say, "We want increasing dividends," their first comeback was, "Can we get dividends restored and then keep them stable?" So they moderated their expectations about that. And the board members, particularly the independent board members that they added to their board, were instrumental in areas like acquisitions, divestiture and acquisitions, and guiding that process and helping them make decisions about what businesses and what industries they can be in. And now I would argue, despite the fact of being a different business, they're as strong as ever, if not stronger.
Yep.
And they are as committed as a family to each other and to the business, if not more so, for having lived through this experience. So, it's not everything shut down all at once because of a disease, and
Right.
because the government told them to.
Right.
But between the, disruption is a word that's thrown around constantly right now. The media industries have been really disrupted.
Yeah.
And they found a way to get through it. Many of our other clients, a few of them are still producing newspapers. Their revenues are 10 or 20% of what it used to be. And their profits are, if they have profits, commiserately low.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
No, it's a great story of resilience and being able to reinvent oneself. And I think it's very challenging for some businesses, especially I think of the newspaper, when you're such a part of the fabric of a community, and in a sense, your sense of connection to being part of the democratic process, right? That you're informing your community about news and events, et cetera. And I know that it's that's a process as well. But having gone through that and being stronger on the other side, it's about how do we redefine connectivity in the modern era, right? And so thinking about that is an important part of the value add that they bring to their customers, and also what's meaningful and resonant for them as a family, but having the flexibility to recast that with new tools, right? Which is in effect kind of what they've done.
And in the case of Schurz, they're in South Bend, Indiana. They could have had a good time with the recent Democratic primaries, but they were the newspaper of record, right, in their town, and they were the publishers, and they were essential to it. They sold that newspaper along with all the rest, so they gave up everything you're talking about, yep, in terms of their traditional role and their traditional values vis-a-vis the community. Yep. Now, this makes a good segue, because the second example went in exactly the opposite direction, mm-hmm, and doubled down on exactly what you're talking about. Its role, its responsibility, the role of the free press, of providing information. And the company I'm talking about now, and again, I'm much has been said about this in the past, and including a book that was published that included my consulting work in the book. But this client's the New York Times. And the New York Times took exactly the opposite approach, except going back to before all the troubles began, going back to before the disruption, going back to before the Great Recession, as the third generation leaders of the New York Times contemplated transition to the fourth generation of the New York Times. And now, by the way, the fifth generation, right, are the leaders of the New York Times. They pondered, I remember the four siblings, Punch Sulzberger and his three sisters, saying, well, we know how we work together and how we make decisions together, but we have 13 children, and how the heck are they ever going to do it? Right. And it was a big question, and we went through a long process that I won't get into the details. This is what was written up in this book called The Trust. But essentially what they did, they're a publicly traded company, so they had a board of directors. The family, there are voting and non-voting shares. So the family controls who's on the board, even though it's a public company. Mm-hmm. And they had terrific directors, and they always had a great commitment to outstanding governance. And since they are trying to preach outstanding governance to the rest of us as it relates to our country, you would think they would, and they did. And their directors were the CEO of IBM and Cyrus Vance, the former Secretary of State, and that ilk of people. But they weren't organized as a family. And what we in effect did through the process of answering the question, how the heck are the 13 of them going to get together and make this work, was to establish a very rigorous family governance process and a very strong family council, family assembly kind of structure. They worked as a team. The 13, their spouses, actually some of their children were already of adults, so they were part of the process too. And their parents gave them a list of questions they wanted to have answered about how the business would be run. How will they make decisions? How will we determine who works in the business? How will we determine who runs the business? Will the family continue to be in the key leadership positions in the business? And there were 3 pages, single-spaced of questions. And they said to their kids, the 4 of them stood in front of the next generation and said, we want the answers to these questions in 6 months, and we want one answer from all of you. And they went to work, and they split up the questions. They into 6 buckets. They set up 6 task forces. Each task force worked to figure out how to respond. What's our foundation going to look like? All these different questions.
Right.
How do we handle our trusts? And after some period of time and quite a few meetings, we had 6 reports. The 6 reports were read to everybody, and it was determined that one of their number, Arthur Golden, would go to work in bringing all 6 reports into one document. Arthur had been working on what he called the Great American Novel for 11 years unsuccessfully. His cousins kidded him about it and said, here, take a break and write this for us. And he did. And then he went back to writing his book, which turned out to be Memoirs of a Geisha, by the way. It was a best-selling book.
Very good book.
And great movie. And then they gave the report to the parents. And that report has been a blueprint ever since. The family met regularly. They were elected. The family members of the board were figured out how that would be done. And this became a huge issue when the great New York Times was faced with the same disruption problems. Right. It was bleeding revenue. It had made a lot of acquisitions, some of which they bought the Boston Globe and affiliated publications for $1 billion. Then Wall Street said they overpaid, and Punch Sulzberger said, no, we're going to be using this for the next 2 generations. They sold the Boston Globe for $70 million.
Oh, wow.
$1 billion to $70 million. And what they decided to do was double down on their core asset, the New York Times itself. Right. So we're not going to get out of the journalism business. We're going to understand that our business is collecting information. We're going to trade on this massive international brand name that we've created, which is based on the trust and confidence that at least many people give to them. They are still controversial as being liberal, obviously, and not respected by everybody, including our president, who talks about the failing New York Times. They're not failing anymore. They're making profits. Their stock is up or was up before the most recent crash that we've had. Right. And they've found that they've done a better job than anybody else in figuring out how to generate revenue from the collection of information and the distribution of information through the internet. And they sold every other asset. They sold their television stations. They sold their other publications. They had interest in sports teams and sports networks. They sold everything to support the New York Times. And they could not have done that if there were not a complete commitment, right, among a cohesive family ownership group who said, we are the New York Times, we have an obligation. And they'd really done this many times in their history. They always told the story about during World War II, when there was paper rationing, every other newspaper cut their news hole and increased the percentage of the newspaper going to advertising. The New York Times increased its news hole and cut its advertising. In other words, reducing its revenue. Right. They pointed to the Pentagon Papers, which they published at risk of recognizing that it might put them out of business to publish it. But their slogan said, "Without fear or favor," and all the news that fits that fits to print. That's fit. That fits. And they went forward, and they went forward not without trepidation. They also went forward with family leadership. So they made a decision back when I was working with them. It was who must be family members. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Who must be family members in leadership? And they said, we can have a non-family CEO. but we need two positions that remain in the family: chairman and publisher.
Okay.
And then they said, and we as a family have a responsibility to make sure that we identify and develop the right people to be able to assume those positions. And they develop programs and processes for doing that.
Right.
So here, they took the opposite of what the prevailing wisdom was, which is, sell your media while you can and redeploy it into something else. And they said, no, our nation and our world needs what we are and who we are at the New York Times. And we're going to do that. And we're going to figure out a way to do it and a way to remain profitable doing it and continue to play the role that we've played for over 100 years at this point.
So that sense of shared responsibility that the family had, that's kind of a core part of their identity, right? Is it helped align their commitment to, as you said, I mean, that was taking a massive risk, right? I mean, yeah, typically you'd want people to diversify and expand their whole, even if they wanted to stay in the traditional media but what you're saying is they actually divested everything else so that they could kind of put the full bet just on this one significant asset and then really commit themselves to being able to be the best stewards and the best, owners of this asset.
And they really believe, and they told stories to reinforce it. And I won't share the story because it's too dramatic and too private, but they really believe that their role in continuing to produce the New York Times was more important than their individual lives.
Right.
And they would say things like, thousands have died protecting our freedoms, and what we're doing depends on those freedoms. And if we have to die, we would die too.
Right. That deep commitment. And I think that's, one of the things that people appreciate, is being part of something that's greater than themselves. And I think in particular in these difficult times, right, feeling that we have that sense of connectivity, and that's a strength of families, that they feel that sense of unity together, and that they have this greater purpose, that they have a business that is creating employment or bringing information and news to a wide audience, right? That they see that as a shared way for them to make an impact and make a difference in the world. So
absolutely,
there's a lot of strength there, and great stories, Craig. So I really appreciate you taking the time this morning to share that, and hopefully folks can just appreciate those insights and think about what their shared purpose is as a family, and what are the lessons that they can maybe harvest from their own history, that in all these different businesses over the generations have been through different kinds of hard times or challenges, whether they be external circumstances or just internal distress or challenges in the business, that somehow that resilience that family businesses typically will have to innovate and align themselves and carry through. So
really great to see you, Stephanie.
Yep. Thank you very much.
For your leadership.
And yours.